Hey everyone, welcome back to Pushing Film. This is going to be a look at Negative Lab Pro, which is a plugin for Adobe Lightroom that makes scanning negatives at home a lot easier, especially color negatives, which is something that I've personally struggled with a lot, trying to get good colors at home using especially the built-in software or other software that you get with typical flatbed and other scanners. If you haven't seen the previous video in this series about DIY film scanning, have a look at that. I go more into the details of making the scans that you need to use with Negative Lab Pro. If you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link to that up there and check that out if you want a bit more of the background on how I got to the point of having that raw scan of the images, because that's what I'm going to be using in this video in these examples that I'm going to give you. So most ideally, as mentioned, you're going to start with a macro scan, or you can use a linear scan created with a flatbed scanner or similar. I find that those work better with medium and larger format negatives. You can get decent results with 35mm, but when it comes to 35mm, I find you'll get a much better detailed scan using a macro camera setup. So let's talk about when would I actually use this sort of process to convert my negatives. Because most of the time, you're probably getting your film processed by a lab and getting scans straight off the bat, which is fine. I actually do that. But you can't always afford, for example, to get really high-res scans. Or sometimes you might not get the exact results you're after with the lab scan. Or sometimes you might be developing your own color negative film at home, which is something I do, especially when I'm shooting Kodak Vision motion picture film, because I can't take that to a lab, so I'll process that at home. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first examples I'm going to show you will be a roll of Kodak Vision 250D that I developed at home, and I scanned using a macro setup as described in my previous video, and converted it all with Negative Lab Pro using the batch scan feature. So the way I'm going to do this video, I'm going to go through some example scans that I've done. I've got the laptop here, and keep in mind that I will be speeding some of these segments up a little bit, especially bits where I'm sort of converting the negatives and we just need to get through it to get to the point. All right, so what you can see here is all my converted negatives. I've gone ahead and done the white balance and cropping of the negatives, which I'll go into more detail on later. But just to give you a quick example of what the workflow looks like, it's going to analyze each photo individually, which is one of the best features of this software, which is generally always going to give you a better result. All right, so we did speed through that here, and what you can see is the Negative Lab Pro module pops up, and that's where you get to have more control over the scan. Now, what you might notice about this review is I'm not going to go into too much of the technical detail of how to actually use the software. I know it might come across a little bit confusing, but what I'm trying to do is give you my take on how effective Negative Lab Pro is. Another reason I won't go into too much detail is because Nate actually has a fantastic guide on how to actually use his software on his website. So I'll put a link to that below if you actually do want to use the trial and you do want a lot of an in-depth look at how it works and how to use the software. There's a long video on the website. Go have a look at that. But I'm just going to sort of breeze through a lot of this. So don't mind that, but what we want to do is look at the results we can get with the software. So once I've made the conversion of all these negatives on this roll of film, I can make some adjustment, because what I tend to find with Kodak Vision, sometimes there's a bit of a cyan or blue cast to the whole roll, which is sort of normal. I even get that with lab scans. So what I can do is make adjustments and then sync those settings across the entire roll. Once again, in Nate's video guide to the software, you can see more details on how that actually works, but it is quite effective in taking a slight adjustment, such as a color cast that's across the entire roll, and then applying that to all the images. And beyond that, if you have a few images that still don't come out quite right, you can go back and make individual adjustments to all the settings in a very similar way to how you would have control using a lab scanner. So if it was a Fuji Frontier or a Noritsu, you generally have red cyan, green magenta, and blue yellow controls, which are the three most important controls when it comes to color balancing your negative scans, and one of the reasons why a lot of the time you don't get very good scans back from a lab. The other big important thing is the density adjustment. And one of the great things I find about Negative Lab Pro is that it has a really effective auto color and auto density adjustment. Now, it doesn't always work perfectly, but most of the time I find it gives you a really good starting point. And you can just go ahead and make individual tweaks to some of the shots on the roll if they didn't come out quite how you like them. And just flipping through some of the results I got here on this roll, it all looks really good. This is one of the first times I scanned an entire roll with Negative Lab Pro. And not only is Kodak Vision 250D quite a sharp film, but I find that scanning it with this method using the macro scan and Negative Lab Pro, I'm getting really good colors with it without too much messing around. So this next negative here is one of the ones I showed in my previous demos of the software. It was a shot on Pentax 6.7's Portra 160, and it was really straightforward conversion with this one. I just went back, unconverted it, converted again to give you an idea, but you can see the tones and the colors, everything came out really nice. I did make a few slight adjustments, but it was really straightforward, and you can see that you get amazing sharpness and detail when you're combining it with a macro scan especially. So that's one of the great things I like about Negative Lab Pro, is just how well it integrates into Lightroom. All right, so let's have a look at another shot here. What I have is one of the photos I took during my drive out into the country with Robin from the YouTube channel The Real Sir Robin, and we took some photos of some fire service workers doing some burn off out in the country. So with the original scan that I've got here, it's actually done at Work in Process Lab on Fuji Frontier at a low resolution. So this is really useful to go back and rescan images, especially if you want a high resolution, or you find that the contrast or something wasn't quite right, which is something you can't really reduce contrast or overcorrect contrast that you get back in a small res JPEG scan. So looking at this image here, the colors are actually quite great. I love the photo and the mood of it, but I was thinking of printing it big, and the problem is there's a bit of loss of shadow detail in the tree and the dark bits here, and it all just sort of goes to black. So what I've done, I've got the macro scan of the image, and the first thing we do with Negative Lab Pro is color balance off of the film mask, which is one of the blank parts surrounding the film image there. And then you can see that's done that. And we crop it as a 3:2 ratio, open the plugin, and again, I'm speeding through this here, but I've got it set on Frontier. I just click apply, and it converts it to a positive image. And then it reopens the dialog here, which is where you can make adjustments. So one of the things I'm doing here is using auto color and density, which has already improved a fair bit. And the great thing about auto color and density is you can apply them in percentages. So if you apply auto color, you find it goes overboard, you can change it to a certain percentage of auto color. And then on top of that, you can make adjustments to the color balance down at the bottom here and reduce some of the color casts that you might still see in the image. So we click apply, let Negative Lab Pro do its thing, and we have the raw scan. And one of the best things you'll notice straight away with this is you have a lot more dynamic range to work with. So I've already got a lot more of those details back in the shadows that was lost. And the good thing about that is I have a much more flat scan, which gives me much more leeway for editing and for printing later on. So what I've done here is made some further adjustments on that scan to try and get it more towards the nice colors that I really love with the Fuji Frontier scan that I got back from the lab, but while retaining a little bit of that shadow detail. And we're putting them side by side here. And what you can see already is you've got nicer detail in the highlights where the fire is. I really like the way the fire looks with the Negative Lab Pro scan, which is on the left. And you can see obviously it's a much higher resolution. And you've got nicer detail on the branches and in the highlights there. And it just gives you a much better working base to start from on some of the important images that you want to go further with later on. All right, so let's take a look at another negative. Now this one is from a roll of Kodak Ektar, shot on the Nikon FE. And Kodak Ektar can sometimes be a notoriously hard film to scan with some scanners, especially with Fuji Frontier. I find Ektar scans a lot better on Noritsu scans. So what I've got here is a really good Noritsu scan of a frame of Ektar. But this is going into another reason why you might want to use Negative Lab Pro, even though you might already have a really nice scan. So sometimes if the image is too low resolution to print big, or if you need to deliver a high resolution file for online usage, this is another great chance to use Negative Lab Pro, and then you have that lab scan which works as a good proofing file to try and get the good colors that you might like from a Noritsu or a Frontier scan, but just give you a much higher resolution result that you can use later on. So you can see it's got great colors, this scan. Nothing's actually wrong with it. It's just a little bit low res. So I've got my macro scan version here, and we're gonna color correct, crop, and go into Negative Lab Pro, let it do its thing. And again, play around with auto color, auto density. They tend to work quite well, but you can reduce the amount of auto correction and then make further adjustments beyond that. You do the conversion, and there you go, it's that easy. And what we're gonna do now is put these images side by side and just have a look at some of the differences in color. All right, so once again, you can see that the lab scan does have more contrast and a little bit less dynamic range, which is actually a good thing. If you're planning on editing the image further, this is the chance where you have that little bit more wiggle room to do edits and to add that contrast, for example, where with a lab scan, sometimes it's really hard to reduce the contrast. All right, so let's have a look at some of the results you can get with portraits, and especially concerning skin tones, which is something that can be quite hard to get right using a flatbed scanner. Okay, so this is another image I've gone ahead and converted using Negative Lab Pro, and I've also made a scan using my Epson V800 and Silverfast software. So one of the interesting things about Silverfast is it has a bunch of film presets, or film color profiles if you want to call it that, and including Kodak Ektar, which is what this negative actually was. It was Kodak Ektar. So I went in Silverfast and applied the Kodak Ektar setting, scanned that. All right, so what we're looking at here is 3 different scans. Starting from the left, you have the lab scan, which is done on a Noritsu scanner, which tends to give fantastic sharpness. And this is done at high res, so it's going to be a really good benchmark to compare to. But one of the things you notice is it looks a little bit muddy, a little bit dark and high contrast. So there's not as much detail in the shadow and the skin tones there, but you have great colors. Probably the best colors out of these 3, I would say, at the moment. And then in the middle, you have the scan from the V800 using the Kodak Ektar preset on Silverfast, but I'm not too impressed with this. And this is typically the kind of result I get using a flatbed scanner and the software. So even though it's worked quite well, there is a bit of a weird color cast. It's sort of a bluish purple look, almost like Velvia. To me, it doesn't look anything like Kodak Ektar should look. But you can still correct this later on. And then on the right, you have the scan from Negative Lab Pro, which again, in my opinion, is giving us the best base to work from. It's got the flattest look, it's got the most dynamic range. There's a lot more brightness and detail in the skin tones. So in my opinion, this out of the 3 is the best option to start with. All right, so next, let's have a look at the edited versions of these 3, where we use each one of these scans as a base to work from, and then compare the 3 edited versions of them. All right, so what we're looking at here is a comparison between the edited lab scan and the Negative Lab Pro scan. And immediately zooming in here is what you can see is much better rendition of skin tones. There's less of a red cast in the skin, and there's better sharpness and grain reproduction. Now the grain reproduction is something unique to the fact that it's been scanned with the camera, which always gives you better grain reproduction. And compared to a high-res Noritsu lab scan, this is actually quite a good result, and that's something that's going to reflect, especially if you're printing an image. Again, you can see really great sharpness on the Negative Lab Pro scan, which is on the right-hand side. Okay, and now comparing the V800 scan on the left and the Negative Lab Pro scan on the right. With the V800 scan using Silverfast, there was that color cast, and I struggled a little bit to try and get rid of it. And what it involved doing is messing around with individual color curves and opening up the blue channel and then the red channel and trying to reduce some of that purple in particular parts of the image, like the shadows, and a lot more messing around to get it to this point. It does look pretty good now, but it still took me a lot longer than the amount of time I spent tweaking the Negative Lab Pro scan. And even after that, you can see that the whites don't look quite as good, in my opinion at least, on the V800 scan, even though both of these were white balanced using that white wall behind her. And also, again, you can see that much better grain reproduction and sharpness from the macro scan on the right using Negative Lab Pro compared to the V800 scan on the left. And this is something I typically find with flatbed scans, even with medium and larger formats, is that you lose a lot of that nice grain structure, which you want to see when you're shooting film, and especially the way the film holders work. And the fact that it scans from underneath, I think you don't get as much of that grain reproduction. All right, so I've got another portrait here taken on Fuji 400H with the Pentax 6.7, and what we've gone ahead and done is again just converted it using Negative Lab Pro, made the adjustments, applied it. So what we're going to do here is put it side by side with the lab scan that I got back, which was a perfect scan. And what I've tried to do is get the Negative Lab Pro scan to match the lab scan as much as I can. And another great thing that you can do in Lightroom is use the reference view when you're in the develop module. So that's a really handy tool. But when you zoom in here, what you can see is with the Negative Lab Pro scan, which is on the right, compared to the lab scan on the left, the colors look a little bit different. So as much as I tried to match them, you can see that the reds and blues, they're not quite the same. And this doesn't really matter because which one you think looks better is down to preference. I personally do like the colors from the lab scan a little bit more. But what I tried to do in this scenario is match it using the HSL module in Lightroom. And that can involve a little bit of messing around. So what I noticed especially, and this is something that Robin messaged me about, he had some results where reds, especially with Fujifilm, didn't look quite right. And this is something I am starting to notice with some of my more recent scans, especially with Fuji, is that the reds don't look quite the same, or the warm tones in general. But after a little bit of tweaking, you can see I tried to match it as well as I could, and although it is a great scan, especially considering it was done at home with a single frame capture on a macro digital camera setup, didn't use a panorama stitch here, just did a really quick snap of the frame and converted using Negative Lab Pro, made some tweaks, and I can get a scan that I would say is probably as good a quality as the lab scan. But the great thing about lab scanners is they tend to give you really good colors. That's why they are used in labs. They are designed to give you good colors straight out of the machine, especially when there's an experienced operator behind the scanner. And this is an example of where I've done as much as I can to try and match a lab scan, but it still isn't quite there. Okay, so I've got another frame here, which was again scanned by Brock over at Work in Process. On the left-hand side, we have the Negative Lab Pro conversion that I did, and on the right-hand side was the scan from Work in Process done on the Fuji Frontier. And the scan from Work in Process is fantastic. It's a great scan, colors are good, and the only thing is if I wanted a higher resolution, I could use my home setup to try and get a result that could be used for printing large. But in this scenario, again, this was Fujifilm, and it's a frame of Fuji C200. There is that difference in the colors a little bit, especially again with the reds. The reds on the Negative Lab Pro scan take on a little bit of that magenta shift, whereas the reds personally on the Fuji Frontier scan that I got from Work in Process look a lot better. They're just more of a real deep red. And that's something which is one of the reasons why I'm not going to go into too much more depth on this review, because I've been following the development of an upcoming update for Negative Lab Pro, which is going to take it to version 1.3. And what I've been following is that Nate is planning to make a lot of improvements to the plugin, especially concerning some of the particular results with color casts you get on different film stocks. So what he's going to be adding is the ability to actually choose a film profile. So if it was Fuji C200, maybe I could select Fuji C200 or a similar film like Superior. I didn't have as much of an issue scanning Kodak, but with Fuji I did notice that you don't get those nice Fuji reds that I would come to expect. And besides that, there's going to be a lot more improvements with the upcoming update, and this is going to come out any time now. It might even be launched by the time I put up this video, which is a good reason for me to probably go into another video later on, because not only are they going to be the film profiles, but you can actually select your scanning source. So if you've scanned with a Canon camera or with a flatbed using ViewScan or Silverfast or whatever you've done, you can actually select that as the source to help Negative Lab Pro give you a better conversion. So basically the next update to the software is going to be a major one, and I would highly suggest that if it does come out soon, anyone who hasn't yet tried the software, do give it a try. And I'm personally going to be really looking forward to that update and see how the software continues to evolve and improve with scanning different film stocks especially. Alright, so the last frame we're going to look at here is a black and white negative. I'm not going to go into too much detail on black and white because personally I haven't really ever struggled too much converting black and white negatives. But again, Negative Lab Pro does have the feature. All you do is once you've done the same correction of the mask, you crop it. It's not important to crop out all of the edges as it is with color negatives, but then you go to the little drop-down box where it gives you the different scanners and you choose black and white. And you do your conversion, and the same thing's going to happen where the module pops up on the left, and then you can make further adjustments from there, adjusting brightness, lights, darks, and so on. So as with the color process, you hit apply, takes you back into Lightroom. And let's have a look at this scan compared to my scan that was originally done on the Epson V800. And this is a frame of Berger Panchro 400 taken on the Nikon FE with a 28mm lens. And looking at it here, we've put the flatbed scan on the left and the Negative Lab Pro scan on the right. And immediately I can see a little bit better contrast and tones on the Negative Lab Pro conversion on the right. But that's probably due to the fact that it's a sharper image. It was done using a macro setup, which is zooming in here, you can see going to give you much better grain reproduction. You can actually see the grain of the film a lot better with that scan that's been done on the macro and DSLR setup. So that again doesn't have too much to do with Negative Lab Pro, but zooming back out, you can sort of see that the tones are a little bit better on the Negative Lab Pro. You can see on the back of his hair there, on the shoulder, the highlights do look a little bit better. But this particular scan was a quick rescan I did. I didn't put too much time into it, I quickly just snapped it. And the problem is, you can see here in the corner that it isn't as sharp in the corner because I didn't get the tripod perfectly straight. I kind of rushed it, and you can see a lack of sharpness and detail, especially in that background part there, so please don't do that if it's an important shot. Try and get your camera as flat to the film plane as you can. This was more just for the purpose of comparing the grain detail and the tones you get with the film, which again, with Negative Lab Pro is going to give you really great results with black and white, but I won't go into too much more detail on that. Now, last night, Matt Day over on his channel actually did just put out a video on his workflow, scanning film at home, and he did focus a lot more on black and white, so I highly suggest checking that out. And he uses his Fuji X-T3 in a similar setup using a copy stand, and it's really good to actually see different people's workflows and how they approach the home scanning issue. So if you haven't checked that out, do have a look at it. And also Nick Exposed put out a great video last week where he ran into a lot of detail in a very effective system that he uses to actually convert all of his negatives without ever needing a lab. And he has a really great DIY rig, which I'm actually planning on building my own version of the Nick Exposed rig. But again, he also focuses on black and white. So have a look at those two videos from Nick Exposed and Matt Day over on their channels. And hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea with some of the results and my point of view with getting color conversions from home scans. All right, so my overall impressions of Negative Lab Pro are that it's a great piece of software. This is why we have so many people jumping on and talking about it online, on Instagram, on the Facebook page, on YouTube. We're seeing all these reviews coming out. And it's not for no reason. It's because it is truly a big advancement in the biggest restriction of shooting film and trying to convert it at home and not having access to an expensive lab scanner. This is now allowing us to get scans that are pretty much as good as a lab scan, if not better. Somewhere maybe even close to what you can get with a FlexTight. If you put enough time and effort into getting the image of the negative, having NLP as a plugin is going to be able to take you that much further with getting an image that you can print really big if you want. So it's giving me great colors. It's making the workflow a lot easier. I can use it to scan black and white if I want. And overall, it's a great piece of software, especially considering that one guy came up with it just after he couldn't get good results using anything else and created something that now is available to everyone. And if you haven't already been on the website, do go and check it out. He's got some great videos going over the software. And again, he's got that in-depth guide if you want to know how it works in much more detail. So I'd like to thank Nate again, and I'm really looking forward to some of those updates coming out of the new version, and hopefully the software will continue to improve, because although the results were generally quite good, I did notice a little bit of difference in the colors I was getting between lab scans and Negative Lab Pro. So I think that's something that's going to continue to evolve, especially when that feature to have the film profile selection comes in and the source selection. So hopefully in the future I'll do another video with version 1.3 or even something newer if it comes out by then. And what I would really like to do is I'm waiting for an upcoming product called the Pixelator. And it's currently a pre-order campaign. But what that is a great device to allow you to hold negatives. So you can use that with your home scanning setup and use a multitude of different light sources, because it does have a diffusion panel at the back. And I think that's something that in combination with Negative Lab Pro can take your home scanning process that much further. So I am really looking forward to getting an early copy of the Pixelator product, which will hopefully help speed up the physical part of the scanning process. And then combining that with Negative Lab Pro, I want to do a video in the future where hopefully I can put those two products together and get even better results scanning color negatives at home. All right, guys, so thanks for watching my review of Negative Lab Pro. And hopefully we'll get to look at the software again in the future as it evolves. And what I'm going to be doing next is the third part of this 3-part video series. So the first one was about the scanning process. This one's been about converting using Negative Lab Pro. And the next one I want to do is about printing from your film scans. So hopefully I'll see you on that next video, and thanks for watching.